Between 1880 and 1890, the Everton sugar plantation in northern Louisiana maintained the region's highest output per acre. Yet in parish census logs from 1883 to 1891, 41 workers listed as employed by Everton disappeared from records without formal exits, death registrations, or known transfers. No official investigation was opened, and no employer was ever held liable. In the decades since, Everton's once booming operations were quietly shuttered and the land passed to unrelated private owners. No trace of the laborers has ever been confirmed. Publicly, the Everton Sugar Company was considered a model employer in post-Reconstruction Louisiana. Its contracts with local agricultural colleges, its visible support for road and bridge development, and its compliance with new labor laws gave it an elevated reputation in the eyes of regional officials. The Plantation Chapel, completed in 1884, was presented as a symbol of moral renewal in a time of economic rebuilding. Company bulletins praised the workforce's dedication and emphasized the owner's commitments to education and fair treatment. Few questioned why its employment ledgers included such irregular accounting, or why dozens of contracts were sealed with no family witnesses present. In 1880, the Everton Sugar Company maintained operations over 700 acres of cultivated cane fields with an adjacent processing facility located on the eastern tract. The company was headquartered on site in a large timber building constructed in 1878, which housed administrative offices, accountancy records, and a rotating staff of supervisors. A separate registry hall, located across from the chapel, was designated for labor sign-ins, contract archiving, and official correspondence with local authorities. Supervisors were chosen from among landowners in surrounding parishes, appointed in part due to family ties and prior military rank. Most lived seasonally in lodging houses built behind the mill, with private servants and contracted bookkeepers. These managers composed reports to the Everton Board in New Orleans, who visited only twice per year. The physical and financial distance between executives and field labor allowed middle-tier administrators near-complete autonomy in day-to-day governance. Labor recruitment was largely internal. Everton maintained a consistent workforce of just under 200 by 1882, primarily composed of men who had worked on other plantations before the Civil War and their descendants. Hiring records for that period include first names, assigned quarters, and a labor code but no family documentation. This absence was not flagged in audits conducted by the Department of Agricultural Statistics, as companies at the time were not required to document kinship links or familial ties in payroll entries. The Plantation Chapel, opened in November 1884, was designed by a regional architect commissioned for other civic buildings in Concordia and Tensas parishes. The structure was built from local pine and painted in whitewash, with a steeple and a rear annex intended for administrative meetings. It held services twice weekly, led by an Everton employee with the dual title of spiritual coordinator and agricultural foreman. According to board minutes, this individual was selected for moral soundness and disciplinary aptitude, though no background in theology or ministry was required. Public events were regularly held on Sundays, open to community members from nearby towns. Attendance registers showed dozens of outside visitors over the course of 1885, drawn by sermons and choir exhibitions. This visibility gave the Everton site a perception of openness and legitimacy, which was reflected in editorials printed in the Regional Gazette of Northeastern Louisiana. In an 1886 article, the chapel was referred to as a clear sign of religious order among an industrial class, too often left in unstructured idleness. The company maintained its civic image through sponsorships. It funded repairs to a nearby levee road in 1887 and contributed lumber to the construction of a parish schoolhouse in 1888. Photographs taken at the time show Everton's directors attending public ceremonies, standing with clergy, educators, and local merchants. This presentation framed the plantation as a moral and economic cornerstone during a period of regional instability, when labor shortages and market fluctuations impacted sugar output across much of the state. Internally, Everton's operations were documented through extensive handwritten ledgers stored in its central archive. Pages included entries for weekly yields, disciplinary actions, absences, and reassignments. Notably, the documentation lacks consistent year-over-year entries for certain names, with over 40 individuals appearing in records for short periods before disappearing entirely from the registries without. Annotated cause. These disappearances were not addressed in board correspondence. Memos from the years 1885 to 1889 make no mention of terminations or voluntary departures beyond seasonal fluctuations. In interviews decades later, conducted by oral historians compiling plantation testimonies, several former residents of neighboring towns recalled being discouraged from asking about workforce changes. The public was generally told that workers had transferred to newer industrial sites closer to Baton Rouge, though no verification of these transfers exists. Despite the irregularities, Everton's reputation remained intact. Its productivity figures placed it among the top 10 sugar exporters in the northern half of the state for 5 consecutive years. The official agricultural census of 1885 lists the plantation as operating at 93% labor efficiency, a rate that surpassed most competitors in the region. No regulatory review was initiated to examine how such efficiency was achieved, despite an unusually high turnover among unnamed contract laborers. Part of this resilience can be attributed to Everton's accounting model. The company used a system of internal credit vouchers rather than traditional wages, issuing workers slips that could be exchanged only at a plantation-run general store. This minimized the amount of recorded cash flow, reducing the paper trail that external auditors might have followed. Workers unable to redeem their vouchers off-site had limited leverage in disputes or grievances, a fact that local legal advocates acknowledged but rarely challenged in formal complaints. Relocation data from surrounding parishes also fails to account for the movements of the missing Everton workers. Civil ledgers from 1885 through 1890 list no surge in new resident filings that would suggest a mass transfer of agricultural labor. Furthermore, voter rolls and church rosters from nearby counties do not reflect the addition of new families matching Everton's internal records. These absences suggest that if workers did leave Everton, they did so without the civic documentation typically associated with regional migration. Census officials in the area were not required to perform direct verification of employment contracts. Their role was limited to population counts and household summaries, which were often based on declarations from property owners. In Everton's case, declarations were signed by the plantation's bookkeeper, not by the laborers themselves. This administrative gap allowed the company to report consistent numbers even during years when visual counts of workers fluctuated. In 1888, the Department of Labor sent a standard survey to sugar producers throughout Louisiana, including Everton. The questionnaire included queries about labor satisfaction, turnover rates, and safety practices. Everton's response, signed by its field overseer, stated that all labor concerns have been addressed in accordance with regional norms, and that no unusual attrition has occurred. The department accepted this submission without follow-up. The plantation chapel continued to operate during this time without public disruption. Event flyers from 1889 show that Sunday services, musical recitals, and children's classes were still held regularly. The chapel bulletin did not acknowledge any changes in workforce composition, nor did it reference individuals by name beyond clerical staff and instructors. Its language emphasized community, perseverance, and the proper alignment of order in labor and rest. Visitors to the site during those years described Everton as visibly prosperous and quietly managed, with one travel diary noting the absence of public unrest or misalignment among its staff. These accounts, preserved in state archives, reinforced Everton's external image as a self-contained and efficient operation, even as internal records showed increasing gaps in the continuity of its labor force. By the close of 1889, the plantation filed one of its last full production reports, citing excellent yield and minimal workforce turnover. The report praised the supervisory staff for maintaining discipline and consistency, and recommended the continuation of its operational model without changes. No mention was made of the 41 unresolved labourer absences, nor was any follow-up inquiry ever submitted to the parish office. During the final months of 1889, Everton's general ledger recorded steady output and a surplus in processed cane. Administrative notes included remarks about continued cooperation with shipping firms operating along the Mississippi River, with emphasis on punctual deliveries and low incident reports. Annotations in the margin of these reports, written in shorthand, referenced maintenance of trust through chapel attendance and dispute minimization through early-stage contract containment. These phrases do not appear in prior years' documents, suggesting a shift in management philosophy focused more on internal stability than public outreach. The plantation's supervisory board underwent a partial reorganization during this period. 2 long-time overseers left their posts, citing age and health limitations, and were replaced by men with backgrounds in bookkeeping and logistical supply. The transition was conducted without public announcement. Replacement overseers were given expanded access to the plantation's internal record-keeping facilities, including archives not customarily used for routine payroll or production summaries. One newly installed supervisor, a former surveyor from Pointe Coupée, was tasked with reclassifying contract data into alphabetical ledgers, consolidating previously scattered information into indexed volumes. This reclassification effort generated a list of discrepancies. Notes dated January 1890 include a reference to inconsistencies across years 1885-1888 concerning contract numbers 118-147. No explanation was provided for the numbering gaps, nor was any update sent to the regional labour office. However, subsequent entries contain check marks and the initials of 2 senior clerks, signifying that the matter was internally reviewed and archived. A separate file labelled Pastoral Engagement Log was initiated during the same time frame. It was maintained by the spiritual coordinator and contained weekly entries about attendance, topics of discussion, and seasonal concerns. The language used was formulaic and centered on encouragement and cooperation. One entry, dated March 2, 1890, states, "The midweek discussion focused on principles of duty, compliance, and unified goals. Absenteeism was not observed." The pattern of identical phrasing continued through the summer months, with no named participants or deviations from the established structure. Meanwhile, the Plantation store, operated under exclusive contract with the Everton board, began issuing updated voucher slips featuring a revised insignia. This redesign included a crest with 3 sheaves of cane and the Latin phrase laborare est vivere, meaning to work is to live. Receipts from the store indicate a marked decline in redemption requests during spring and summer 1890. Company memos attribute this to increased efficiency, leading to reduced personal downtime. The reasoning was not questioned, and no formal complaint was filed by either workers or supervisory staff. Outside observers continued to view Everton as a model enterprise. A report filed by the Concordia Parish Board of Agriculture in May 1890 praised the plantation's record-keeping methods and cited its chapel program as a rare success in harmonizing labor and spiritual engagement. No mention was made of workforce reductions or employee turnover. The summary expressed confidence in Everton's continued contributions to the regional economy, especially as other plantations were beginning to scale back due to soil exhaustion and declining sugar prices. It was also during this period that an external architectural assessment was conducted on the chapel and adjacent meeting hall. The report, commissioned as part of a routine insurance valuation, noted the building's structural soundness and highlighted its remarkably low wear despite frequent use. The architect described the building as well-preserved, orderly, and used in accordance with its intended function. No further visits were scheduled, and the valuation was approved without revisions. Despite the positive reports, several surrounding landowners began voicing informal observations about the plantation's staffing consistency. In a letter preserved in private archives, a farmer from a nearby tract wrote, "I see fewer field hands crossing the levee road at sunrise than in years prior. though the smoke from the mill remained steady. The letter was not sent to any authority, but was included in a collection of correspondence later donated to a regional historical society. It provides one of the only outside records indicating that Everton's labour operations may have been visibly altered by 1890. The company's internal communication showed no indication of planned workforce expansion or contraction. Budget forecasts remained fixed, with no reallocations for recruitment or separation costs. The Plantation School, which served children of clerical staff, continued to operate without enrollment changes. The school's curriculum included arithmetic, basic agricultural principles, and weekly readings selected by chapel staff. Instructors maintained logs that made no reference to parent attendance or familial connections among the students. Quarter inspections were conducted monthly, according to supervisory reports, with notations of compliance and cleanliness. These reports made no reference to occupancy numbers or changes in lodging arrangements. The same names appear repeatedly as quarter supervisors, all of whom reported directly to the central office. Their records included language such as "units remain orderly" and "no escalations or complaints documented." There are no surviving documents that record a change in housing assignments during this time. Maps produced for administrative use outlined the layout of the plantation, including designated work areas, housing clusters, the mill, the store, and the chapel. These maps were not distributed outside company operations and were annotated with shorthand designations for routes, storage zones, and internal checkpoints. One version from late 1890 includes a lightly penciled boundary labeled Restricted Perimeter, extending beyond the area shown in earlier maps. No explanation was given for this modification, and it was not preserved in subsequent versions. Correspondence between the Everton Board and the Regional Sugar Association shows continued participation in meetings and price stabilization talks. The Everton representative, listed in meeting minutes, regularly contributed commentary on production techniques and employee management. These minutes did not contain any inquiries or remarks about staffing anomalies, nor did other members raise questions about the plantation's operational practices. The Everton Board remained in good standing with all relevant trade groups. As the year closed, Everton filed a summary of its decade-long performance with the parish tax office. This filing included declarations of land use, inventory, and labour input. Figures showed an increase in per-worker output when compared with reports from 1882. The report concluded that efficiencies gained through disciplined coordination accounted for this improvement. No breakdown of individual productivity was provided, and the report was accepted without revisions or requests for clarification. By early 1891, the plantation's leadership transitioned focus to long-term stability measures. Memos included recommendations to further isolate internal processes from external review. One proposal suggested consolidating chapel operations and administrative oversight under a single post, citing alignment of objectives and reduction of logistical redundancies. The board approved the measure, and the position was quietly merged by the end of the first quarter. While Everton's external reputation remained unchallenged, internal documentation began to diminish in detail. By mid-1891, daily labour logs reduced the number of entries per page, with only aggregate figures listed in most sections. Handwritten names were replaced by tallies, and annotations became increasingly generic. Ledger books from this period were bound in plain covers and lacked the indexed inserts that characterized earlier records. The Plantation Chapel continued to issue weekly bulletins, although the final surviving copies from that year contain only abbreviated messages and schedule reminders. Choir rosters and sermon themes were omitted, replaced with short declarations of intent such as productivity through discipline and shared benefit through continued order. These publications, once distributed widely, ceased circulation after August 1891. No formal announcement of closure or transfer was issued by the Everton Sugar Company. By the end of that year, its board members had returned to their respective residences, and no additional production reports were filed. The plantation itself remained structurally intact, though its internal facilities were gradually emptied of staff. The land remained registered under the original corporate name until 1894, when it was purchased by a timber concern headquartered in Baton Rouge. Among the earliest indirect indicators of systemic irregularities at Everton were the inconsistencies in formal correspondence between the plantation's clerical staff and parish notaries. Letters from 1886 to 1889 included multiple contract confirmations with incomplete witness signatures, often missing the standard co-signature line for family members or local clergy. While this omission was not considered a violation under the employment statutes of the time, it diverged from the regional norm, particularly for long-term field appointments that typically required third-party verification. The local notary archive in Concordia Parish retains partial transcripts of Everton's filings, preserved on fragile paper with corner notations identifying labor designations. Of the entries reviewed from that period, over a dozen include the abbreviation CC beside the worker's name, with no explanation provided for its usage. Other plantations use this code to indicate clerical contracts or conscripted convicts, but Everton's records show it beside names assigned to routine agricultural roles. Requests for clarification by external auditors were not filed. In spring 1887, a rural administrator from an adjoining property submitted a routine land border inquiry to the Everton office asking for updated survey coordinates. The Everton response, signed by its senior overseer, declined to provide specifics, stating that the eastern perimeter has been adjusted internally and remains a matter of private designation. While legally permissible, this response was noted by the administrator in a private diary, later donated to the Concordia Historical Cooperative. In that entry, dated April 12, 1887, he wrote, "No public marker or title ledger reflects any change, yet they maintain the alteration without dispute." His note remained unshared until its recovery in the 1930s. Further minor irregularities emerged through correspondence with the Regional Livestock Procurement Board. Everton submitted requests for harness materials and grain supplies inconsistent with the number of active animals declared in their agricultural census. For instance, the order logs from 1888 include requisitions for 17 sets of yoke harnesses, while only 9 draft animals were listed as active. The procurement office fulfilled the order without challenge, and no internal report was triggered. Shipping manifests from the same year documented an uptick in bulk food deliveries unrelated to standard provisioning cycles. A delivery manifest from July 1888 recorded shipments of cornmeal, salted fish, and dried fruit, exceeding the quantities needed for the number of registered workers on site. These logs, stored in the archives of the New Orleans Trade Authority, were not reconciled against population reports and were assumed to represent seasonal overstocking. However, no returns or redistribution notes were filed in subsequent quarters. Meanwhile, a parish school inspector tasked with surveying educational facilities in the area made a scheduled visit to Everton's schoolhouse in autumn 1888. His travel notes include a reference to well-maintained grounds, quiet demeanor among staff, and absence of child congregation at recess. While no concerns were raised at the time, he added, "Schoolroom contained only ledgers and slates on desks. No indication of instructional materials in use that day." The inspector's comments did not reach the Parish Education Board until 1891, by which point the Everton facility had ceased operations. A further detail appears in visitor logs kept by a travelling reverend based out of Natchez. His circuit included Everton's chapel, where he was scheduled to deliver guest sermons quarterly. In his journal, preserved in the seminary archives, he noted after his March 1889 visit, "Congregation present, though many faces unfamiliar. Administrator advised not to request individual introductions." In a later entry from August that year, he wrote, "No invitation received this quarter. Communication ceased without notice." These entries marked the end of his documented involvement with the plantation. Rail manifest records, preserved at the Louisiana Transportation Exchange, show that Everton received multiple shipments labeled as equipment crates during 1889, though the invoices lacked detailed contents. The crates originated from Baton Rouge and were listed under a commercial supplier known primarily for mechanical parts and structural reinforcements. Delivery receipts were signed not by Everton's purchasing officer, but by a newly appointed clerical assistant whose name does not appear in prior records. This assistant signed 3 subsequent delivery manifests, then disappeared from all official documentation by year's end. County health logs offer another layer of discrepancy. A standard medical census conducted by Concordia Parish in 1890 requested data on Plantation infirmary activity. Everton responded with a statement indicating no health anomalies to report and no infirmary usage recorded in the prior 18 months. This stood in contrast to regional patterns, where even well-run plantations typically logged minor injuries, seasonal ailments, or periodic quarantines. The absence of any entries raised no official concerns, but a physician who reviewed the records in the 1920s later noted the submission's unrealistic consistency in a private margin note. During an unrelated audit of property taxes in late 1890, a parish clerk cross-referenced Everton's personnel tax filings with housing assignments. The numbers did not align. While Everton reported full occupancy across its 4 housing clusters, the corresponding tax category showed deductions for unoccupied quarters. This suggested a bookkeeping practice that allowed the company to report full staffing for labor purposes while claiming partial exemption from residential taxation. The discrepancy was noted but not pursued, as administrative capacity to review such variances was limited. By this stage, subtle procedural decisions began to narrow access to Everton's site. Road maintenance on the Eastern Tract ceased in early 1891, according to parish transport maps. Travel logs from nearby postal routes list Everton as pass-through only, removing its designation as a distribution stop. The Plantation's main entry road was removed from the regional maintenance schedule and reclassified as private use. No protests or petitions were filed, and Everton's mailing address was quietly shifted to a box held in New Orleans. Evidence of increasing seclusion is also visible in the decline of third-party financial documentation. Local banks, which had previously listed Everton as an active commercial account, ceased publishing its quarterly holdings by mid-1891. This absence coincided with the transfer of Everton's financial operations to an intermediary based in Plaquemine, who handled invoice payments and order fulfillment without direct involvement in labor or property affairs. The intermediary's records were destroyed in a 1904 flood, and no secondary logs were preserved. Among the few remaining documents from this phase is a purchase ledger from a hardware supplier in Vidalia, showing orders for hinges, beams, and ceiling fasteners placed by an Everton supervisor whose handwriting differs from earlier orders. The ledger includes a note from the supplier indicating that payment was made in advance, in cash, and that the client requested discreet packaging. These materials were categorized as structural maintenance, but do not appear in any subsequent repair records or insurance filings. The final indirect signal of procedural anomalies appeared in a memorandum from the Concordia Parish Agricultural Board, dated November 1891. The board noted that Everton had not submitted its annual crop rotation plan, breaking a decade-long practice of full disclosure. The memo concludes with the phrase "no further engagement expected unless prompted," indicating that administrative contact had been suspended by mutual default. The board issued no public statement and removed Everton from its active directory at the close of the calendar year. In early 1892, local administrative archives began experiencing gaps in Everton's correspondence. Until that point, the Plantation had maintained punctual submissions of annual tax forms, crop reports, and employment estimates. The omission of those materials prompted a cursory notice from the parish recorder's office, but it was not followed by an investigation. The official narrative maintained that Everton's seasonal cycle had simply shifted, or that clerical delays had occurred due to changes in staffing. That same year, the Regional Road and Boundary Commission reissued its land use chart for northeastern Concordia Parish. On this version, the Everton tract was labelled as a non-commercial zone, a category typically reserved for fallow lands or properties under dispute. The designation went uncontested. Survey records show no objections filed by Everton or its affiliates. The company's map marker was shaded in a neutral tone with no supplementary annotation, effectively removing it from commercial circulation. Two parish staffers tasked with reconciling property values that Spring attempted to verify structures on Everton's grounds by referring to prior inspection reports. When unable to locate updated valuations, they reviewed older inventories stored at the agricultural registry. Among those papers was a maintenance schedule indicating a pending overhaul of the chapel annex and meeting quarters in 1890, along with associated supply orders. However, no confirmation was found that the work had taken place. No requests for inspection approval were submitted, and the project was later listed as status unverified. In the absence of formal closure documents, speculation arose among a small number of land agents responsible for tracking tax liability in the area. One internal memo suggested the property may have shifted into private stewardship under the pretense of continued corporate use. No transfer deed bearing a post-1891 date exists in parish deed books, but Everton's land designation ceased to appear in subsequent registrar summaries after 1893. This gap was never amended. During this same period, rail delivery logs indicated a rerouting of sugarcane shipments previously attributed to Everton. The bill of lading for an October 1892 transport listed the contents as from unnamed origin, West Bank, between mile markers 27 and 30. These coordinates corresponded approximately with Everton's prior dispatch point. However, the shipment was logged without corporate affiliation, and the carload was attributed to a commercial buyer located in Ascension Parish. This entry marked the last known outbound shipment originating from the Everton vicinity. Privately, a small number of business correspondents began referring to the property as dormant. In a letter dated December 1892, a sugar mill operator from Assumption Parish noted that the Everton tract is now spoken of as functionally concluded, though no formal statement has been published. His letter was addressed to a regional trade broker and contained an inquiry about reclaimable assets, particularly regarding the mill's internal gearworks. The broker replied with a deferral, stating he lacked documentation to pursue an acquisition. Efforts to cross-reference Everton's remaining employee records were made in 1893, when a former auditor reviewing parish ledgers noticed the absence of final contract terminations. Of the names listed in the 1885 Everton Workforce Register, at least 41 were never recorded in adjacent parishes or church communities in the years that followed. This discrepancy was annotated in the ledger margins but left unresolved. The audit was not mandated and was treated as a clerical curiosity rather than a basis for further action. Inquiries by outside researchers in the years that followed were hampered by the disappearance of several foundational documents. Everton's payroll books for 1885 through 1891 were last known to be stored in a secondary records vault located on site, adjacent to the former overseer's quarters. A 1910 visit by a property inspector, commissioned by a timber concern considering acquisition, noted that the records vault had suffered inward warping and extensive mildew. The inspector's notes indicated that only fragments remained legible and that the surviving pages had been detached from their original binding. No effort was made to restore or preserve them. During a 1912 academic survey conducted by the Louisiana Industrial History Society, researchers attempted to reconstruct labor patterns from former sugar plantations. Everton was included in the initial list of sites to be reviewed, but investigators found no individuals who had worked on the property or claimed familial links to its operations. Several area residents recalled the location by name, but described it only as a former mill tract or old road parcel. No detailed oral histories were obtained. Civic directories published in the early 20th century no longer included Everton in their listings. A 1914 Handbook of Louisiana Parishes, compiled for educational use, omitted the property entirely from its sugar production summaries. In private notes, the editor wrote that Everton ceased to be classified as a contributing enterprise by end of the previous century, though he did not cite a specific year. The omission was not contested by any commercial entity or descendant board. In 1921, a local committee studying unclaimed properties reviewed the Everton parcel as part of a broader statewide initiative. Their notes indicate that the land had been sold in 1894 to a timber company under the name Tarson Holdings, but the sale did not include liability for prior operations. The committee found no record of contractual disputes, lawsuits, or abandoned assets associated with Everton. They concluded that the transfer met state conditions for release from historical inquiry. No preservation measures were recommended. Later that decade, a graduate thesis produced at the University of Louisiana attempted to examine land transitions in Concordia Parish between 1870 and 1900. The thesis included a brief section on Everton, noting its abrupt disappearance from tax rolls and production charts. The author observed that, unlike other plantations that were subdivided or converted, Everton left no discernible output, tenant community, or economic trace after its final listing. The work received departmental recognition but was not widely circulated. The former location of the Everton site underwent reclassification in 1932 during a cartographic update commissioned by the state's Department of Public Lands. The updated map depicted the area as undeveloped forest with no structures marked. A corresponding footnote listed the parcel as previously utilized for agricultural industry, now inactive, no public access. The area's prior identification as a plantation was removed from subsequent editions. Decades later, no physical remnants of the original mill or chapel remained. In a 1955 aerial survey commissioned for timberland zoning, the area was shown as densely wooded, with only a narrow service road visible near the western edge. No structural outlines or clearings were detected. The survey team labeled the site as unmodified terrain. Local residents interviewed at the time referred to the tract as uncharted or unused, and none could provide accounts of its previous use beyond vague recollections. By the second half of the 20th century, the Everton property had faded from public documentation. No historical markers were installed, and no preservation campaigns were initiated. Regional historians researching post-bellum plantation systems typically omitted Everton from their surveys due to lack of available data. The absence of concrete records, combined with the lack of first-hand testimony, rendered the site largely inaccessible to academic inquiry. The first documented attempt to reassess Everton's operational history using primary sources occurred in 1936, when a graduate student from Centenary College undertook a project titled Post-Bellum Land Consolidation and Decline in Northern Louisiana. The research, meant to chart institutional closures and rural displacements, encountered difficulties reconciling Everton's employment figures with census records from the 1880s. A note in the student's field log read, "Everton tract figures stable through 1888, then vanish entirely without succession or external reallocation. Staff tallies inconsistent with neighboring movement trends." While the study did not identify irregularities beyond statistical absence, its bibliography listed a source not found in other surveys. A partially intact volume marked Registry C, Internal Order Summaries, 1886-1889, preserved among agricultural ledgers, donated to the college's archives. This ledger, though incomplete and water-damaged, offered several pages of tabulated reports. The entries bore no employee names or personal identifiers. Instead, it contained procedural annotations for an internal grouping system identified as congregational rotations, with subheadings titled Cycle 1, Chapel Initiative, and Cycle 2, Logistical Isolation. Each cycle included corresponding numeric codes and abbreviated remarks. Phrases such as preparation acknowledged, presence verified, and internal movement recorded appeared regularly, but without explanation. No events, outcomes, or external confirmations were listed. The ledger included a series of check marks beside the final entries of each cycle, followed by single-word closures: sealed, compiled, or redirected. The meaning of these designations was not clarified. The student submitted a brief report to the Louisiana State Historical Bureau, noting the presence of these documents and questioning the definitions used within. The Bureau declined to follow up, citing a lack of relevance to known commercial practices. The ledger was retained by the college, but received no further analysis until 1950, when an archivist reclassified it under miscellaneous operational records. The existence of Registry C resurfaced in 1964 when a researcher cataloguing Plantation-era documents for the Southern Inventory Initiative flagged Everton's entry for its untraceable termination. At the time, Everton was the only large-scale plantation in the northeastern region whose postbellum closure had left no residual documentation of sale, court resolution, or final workforce redistribution. The researcher's notes observed, documentation ceases at peak yield. No dissolution, foreclosure, or transfer trail. Personnel terminations not recorded. This discrepancy led to a request for verification from local record offices. The Concordia Parish Administrative Clerk at the time responded with a photocopy of the 1890 tax declaration, which listed Everton's acreage, building counts, and staffing level. All categories were marked consistent with the prior year. The clerk added a handwritten note, no subsequent declarations filed, no known dispute or forfeiture. The absence of any follow-up report was confirmed in the 1891 and 1892 ledgers, which showed Everton's line item crossed out without comment. Efforts to trace the 41 labourers who disappeared from the Everton rolls between 1883 and 1891 were initiated in 1972 by a visiting scholar from Tulane. Using state census records, parish directories, and church registries, the scholar compiled a spreadsheet of entries likely associated with Everton's known employment rosters. Each record was checked against burial registries, property deeds, and marriage licenses in Concordia, Tensas, and Catahoula parishes. The search yielded no new confirmations of residence, relocation, or legal dissolution for those individuals. The scholar's summary, published in a university journal, noted, a population cohort active during a 7-year span at a single site is functionally erased from state civil records without corresponding movement in adjacent civil systems. This is anomalous. The article proposed no cause but called for re-evaluation of institutional documentation practices, particularly among mid-level plantations that operated without centralized oversight. A year later, a private collector contacted the scholar with an offer to share items purchased at an estate sale in Vidalia. Among these items was a bound volume containing chapel programs and clerical orders from 1884 through 1890, all issued by Everton's internal ministry. The programs were printed with standardized text, listing sermon topics and assigned hymns. Certain weeks were marked with the label Internal Congregation Only, while others listed guest participation and open recitation. One note, dated July 13, 1888, included the phrase, Service in rotation, exterior voices omitted. The collector also shared an internal bulletin marked Group 3 Alignment, listing dates and a numbered sequence of locations within the plantation, including dormitories, work areas, and chapel partitions. The meaning of this sequence was not explained. The bulletin included a final notation, confirmation check completed, realignment processed. No signatures or initials were present. These documents, though fragmentary, matched formatting found in Registry C, confirming their origin. Public awareness of the Everton case remained limited until 1981, when a small historical journal in Monroe published a feature on postbellum plantation decline. The article, citing previous academic work, included a short section on Everton's disappearance from the labor registry. It mentioned the lack of personnel transitions and the unusual consistency of chapel programming even as external engagement diminished. The piece concluded with a question: what economic model persists without outward motion, formal exit, or succession? The article prompted limited correspondence from regional history enthusiasts. One letter to the journal from a retired surveyor claimed he had seen a map marked Everton Perimeter, closed loop designation, during his early training. The map, he claimed, was stored at a planning office in Faraday, but was discarded in the 1950s during a consolidation of unused land use documents. The journal noted the letter, but could not verify the claim and issued no follow-up. A more systematic review began in 1987, when a group of independent researchers formed a committee to collect oral accounts from regions affected by postbellum land restructuring. Although Everton was not a central focus, Its absence from known documentation lists was flagged during a planning session. A retired state archivist in attendance noted that certain chapel registries from the 1880s had been received without accompanying membership logs. Everton was among the few sites whose submitted registry lacked personal identification fields. The committee requested access to stored Everton documents previously archived at Centenary College. Upon reviewing Registry C and related chapel bulletins, they identified recurring terms not typical of commercial or clerical usage. Phrases such as confirmation rows, alignment phase, and internal verification by overseer rubric appeared in more than a dozen entries. While no interpretive key existed, the repetition suggested a structured process or internal sequence unique to Everton. The researchers compiled a cross-index of these phrases and compared them to contemporaneous plantation documentation elsewhere in the state. No other site included similar language. A memo drafted by the committee concluded that Everton's procedural vocabulary indicated an institutional culture built around internal movement tracking with minimal external interface. The language used in bulletins and registries did not conform to known accounting, legal, or religious formats of the era. In 1988, the group submitted a report to the State University's Department of Historical Systems, noting the linguistic and procedural irregularities. The department declined to classify the materials as anomalous, citing the lack of corroborating testimony or economic impact. The committee's findings were preserved in a private archive, but were not widely published. In 1991, following a re-evaluation of neglected agricultural archives at Louisiana State University, Everton re-entered scholarly discussion. A faculty archivist cataloging surplus materials discovered a folder labeled Misco Parish Compliance, Internal Rotational Assignments. Inside were 4 pages of tabulated data, printed on Everton letterhead, and bearing faint annotations along the margins. Unlike previous documents, these records included numerical sequences paired with symbols not found in common bookkeeping or religious materials of the time. The pages listed entries under column headers such as phase index, retention alignment, and corrective offset. While no descriptive text was provided, dates from late 1887 to mid-1889 were included beside each row, with markings indicating Cycle 2 reissued and Cycle 3 confirmed. Each table included columns for day count, location tag, and an abbreviation appearing to designate shifts in grouping labeled GRPA through GRPG. The final sheet bore a circular emblem faintly stamped in the center, resembling the crest that once appeared on Everton-issued vouchers. The archivist consulted 2 retired plantation record specialists who had worked on earlier industrial documentation projects. Upon review, both concluded the material could not be classified under traditional production, labor, or payroll categories. One described the entries as notational sequences used for some form of internal reallocation, while the other noted total absence of commodity movement or material accountability. Their assessment was submitted to the university's Agricultural Studies Department, but did not meet threshold criteria for formal archival reclassification. That same year, an independent researcher focusing on non-transactional accounting systems in postbellum enterprises published a review of unused plantation documentation housed across state collections. The Everton materials were briefly referenced, with a note that they represented an atypical model of workforce segmentation and non-externalized personnel cycles. The paper was not distributed beyond academic circles, and Everton was not revisited in follow-up studies. However, interest renewed in 1995 when a preservation consultant from Baton Rouge discovered a bundle of tagged index slips inside a mislabeled parcel at the Concordia Historical Society. These slips, originally filed under weather logs, contained daily entries from Everton's quartermaster's station during the 1886-1888 interval. While brief, each slip listed date, rotation key, and presence indicator. Many slips bore check marks or the abbreviation ACQ beside certain entries. The term was not standard and did not appear in adjacent plantation records from the same period. The consultant compared these tags to partial logs retrieved from nearby properties and found no parallel terminology. Most plantations recorded supply usage, tool inventory, or personnel notes in standard format. Everton's slips contained none of these categories. One series of entries was labelled Interval, Prepared Cycle, Third Path, and included a 3-day sequence of tags with initials that did not correspond to known staff. At the bottom of the final slip, a stamp read, Confirmed through Chapel Entry. Following this finding, the consultant proposed that Everton may have maintained a dual record system, separating external accounts from internal procedural operations. This suggestion was supported by a line found in a company memo from 1889, recovered in a private document trade, and later donated to the Baton Rouge Historical Processing Unit. The memo stated, only Ledger Set B will remain active for regional compliance. All internal proceedings to follow consolidated routine under chapel authorization. The language was not seen in any comparable corporate documents from the region. In 1998, a graduate seminar hosted at the University of Southern Mississippi reviewed archival practices among high-yield agricultural companies operating between 1870 and 1895. Everton was included on a list of institutions with unexplained workforce transitions and was identified as one of only 2 in the region with no recorded termination events. The other, a cotton consortium in Wilkinson County, had been dissolved through court action and left behind extensive dissolution documentation. Everton, by contrast, had no closing ledger, final personnel register, or severance contracts. The seminar compiled these findings into a report shared with select state historical commissions. While no formal investigation followed, the Everton site was quietly added to an internal watch list of non-reconciled institutional bodies. This list, which remained unpublished, included locations deemed historically unresolved due to incomplete administrative closure or archival suppression. By 2002, efforts to produce a digital registry of all known Louisiana sugar plantations brought Everton briefly into renewed focus. While most plantation entries could be supplemented by property deeds, probate accounts, or workforce records, Everton's entry relied solely on second-hand summaries and a collection of anonymized internal memos. The absence of certified closure documents or workforce relocation records caused project supervisors to flag Everton's entry as partially verified, detail suppressed. That designation led to a review of tax filings and bond certifications associated with the Everton board. Among the surviving files was a single entry from 1890, noting a change in bond structure to what was described as internal securities distribution with fixed congregation retention. The phrase did not match any standard financial model of the period. Cross-checking the phrase against other plantation or milling operations yielded no match. Analysts concluded the language likely pertained to internal record maintenance, but its precise meaning remained unclear. The Everton entry was left unexpanded in the digital registry, with a note indicating documentary closure incomplete, employee transition unverifiable. The registry's internal audit log marked it with a conditional status, which prevented further expansion until verifiable estate or succession records could be located. As of 2020, no new documentation has been added. In subsequent years, regional researchers continued to encounter fragments of Everton's internal communication model, typically through indirect correspondence or registry materials bundled with unrelated acquisitions. One such instance involved a 1901 file discovered among court transcriptions in Jefferson Parish. The document referred to Cycle Group 6 retention, though no identifying details were included. It was misfiled under livestock disputes and retained for archival interest only. In 2009, a comparative review of religious industrial overlaps in Reconstruction-era institutions included a short section on Everton's chapel programs. The analysis focused on their language patterns, particularly the repeated use of the phrase internal confirmation alongside rotational designations. The report identified that Everton's chapel bulletin structure closely resembled administrative scheduling tools more than religious communications. The paper posited that the chapel had likely become a procedural hub rather than a spiritual site, facilitating internal group reassignments through structured sequencing. This observation was reinforced by a 2015 translation project examining pre-1900 plantation operational memos. When filtering Everton documents through linguistic comparison tools, analysts observed that over 70% of Everton's phrasing lacked parallel among similarly scaled plantations. The memo styles more closely resembled procedural training manuals or institutional handbooks, featuring language optimized for directive compliance and repetitive structuring. Terminology such as alignment key, group pathway, and rotation adherence suggested a system focused on managing movement and separation. These findings led to one final archival re-evaluation in 2018, when the Centenary College Historical Committee retrieved the original Registry C from off-site storage. Upon conservation review, curators verified that its ink and materials matched the 1880s manufacturing standard and that all entries had been made using consistent pressure and character spacing. A forensic archivist noted that none of the writing appeared to be retrospective or altered. All evidence pointed to contemporaneous record-keeping conducted in real time. The committee prepared a statement affirming the ledger's authenticity and summarizing the primary unanswered question. What operational necessity required a plantation of this size to subdivide its workforce into rotational congregations with no identifiable exit or transition? The question remains part of the Everton file, which has since been categorized under institutional discontinuities pending further discovery. In 2021, during a re-evaluation of parish property maps for inclusion in a statewide digital land use atlas, the Everton tract was assigned a standard code indicating former industrial use with no post-1895 subdivision. The entry included a brief annotation: no commercial inheritance chain, acquired 1894 for timber extraction, no predecessor deed of succession located. The map did not provide historical commentary or site analysis. It functioned solely as a logistical document, yet it triggered a renewed series of inquiries among researchers familiar with long-archived anomalies in Louisiana's post-bellum records. At the State Archives, a historical data analyst tasked with cross-validating the land use index against previously flagged entries noticed Everton's presence on a dormant list labeled Operationally Obscured Properties, Investigative Access Denied. This list, compiled during the late 1990s for internal reference, included fewer than a dozen names. Everton's entry was unique in that it included notations in two handwriting styles, both dated prior to 2000, one of which stated, "Do not confirm designation externally. Processing status incomplete." This discovery led the analyst to file a background inquiry through the administrative clearance channel for dormant commercial records. While standard protocol applied only to corporations dissolved through the state's Secretary of Commerce, Everton's entry returned with a note indicating entity exempt from public reporting at time of dissolution, no conversion filings, closure presumed without declaration. The language confirmed that no legal transition had ever been processed through state commercial channels. Following this administrative dead end, the analyst turned to the physical archive logs stored in a separate wing of the Louisiana Repository for Historical Land Use. There, among bound volumes from Concordia Parish labeled Inactive Commercial Clusters 1850-1900, Everton appeared in a register titled Closure Unknown, Self-Reported Suspension. In that ledger, Everton was listed alongside only two other properties, both of which were religious industrial cooperatives dissolved prior to 1880. The notation beside Everton read, "Reporting ceased without objection. All correspondence retained until 1891. Closure assumed." That designation of assumption rather than confirmation raised additional procedural questions. Under the norms of parish administration during the late 19th century, closure of commercial agricultural entities typically required an observed cessation of tax remittance, notarized land transfer, or notice of occupational termination filed by a surviving board member. Everton had completed none of these. It had simply ceased submitting correspondence, and authorities accepted the silence as a functional withdrawal. This irregularity resurfaced during an unrelated project undertaken by the Department of Educational History in 2022, which sought to identify the origins of non-civic educational facilities in postbellum Louisiana. Everton's schoolhouse, once a registered private facility, lacked any terminal record of enrollment, curriculum closure, or reclassification as abandoned. The school was listed as active in 1890 and was absent from every educational ledger compiled thereafter. The researcher assigned to the project included a footnote: no record of staff relocation or student reassignment. The school ceases mid-cycle with no noted transition. This absence mirrored patterns observed across the rest of the plantation's infrastructure. No formal resolution existed for the chapel, the mill, the housing quarters, or the administrative station. Each functional zone, according to historical planning maps and registry logs, operated in full capacity through 1891, then disappeared from public documentation without a change in classification. Unlike similar properties which either burned, dissolved into residential plots, or entered litigation, Everton was not legally redefined. It was reclassified administratively, but only as a placeholder. This classification shift was eventually noticed by an institutional accountability researcher compiling a digital project titled Unresolved Entities: A History of Untracked Institutional Closures in the Lower Mississippi Basin. The Everton entry appeared midway through the list under the subheading Ceased Without Documentation. The project drew on more than 200 institutional profiles, most involving sudden commercial terminations or unsupervised estate transfers. Everton stood apart in that its workforce had never reappeared in any other institutional system, civic or commercial, statewide. To quantify this gap, the researcher plotted Everton's known worker names from the 1880 to 1890 employment rolls against every parish-level civil document issued through 1900. The results were static. Of the individuals who appeared in Everton's internal ledgers, 41 did not generate a second entry in any other registry. They did not appear in birth, death, property, marriage, judicial, or migration indexes. They were not included in later community rosters, tenant records, or veteran relief applications. Their disappearance did not follow patterns associated with relocation, inheritance, or demographic movement. The researcher's final report included a digital annex with a statistical confidence level exceeding 99% that the names in question did not re-enter the civil system under alternate spelling or regional variants. The conclusion read, "Disappearance from record is absolute across all current searchable indices, no reintegration observed, no plausible alternate identifiers found." The annex did not include narrative interpretation. It remained a closed dataset within the institutional non-compliance category. After this digital publication, Everton gained brief mention in a public history forum focused on archival silences. A contributor specializing in the sociology of compliance structures noted the Everton case as an example of functional non-resolution, in which systemic withdrawal from oversight resulted in implicit deauthorization. The plantation's silence after 1891 had over time been treated as a conclusion rather than a signal. Its disappearance was not questioned because it produced no additional inquiries, complaints, or liabilities. Its record ceased, and the state moved on. Meanwhile, fragments of Everton's language structure, especially as preserved in Registry C and the chapel logs, continued to surface in historical linguistics forums. Their non-alignment with regional, clerical, or legal dialects sparked discussion about isolated operational vocabularies. One linguistic analysis published in 2023 highlighted Everton's unique coupling of procedural phrasing with rotational group indexing. The structure, according to the report, demonstrated syntactic reinforcement of internal positioning without reference to external relational systems. The language was built to manage continuity within, not communicate beyond. The report's closing remarks observed that Everton's system reflected a finalized interior structure incompatible with civic frameworks. In effect, Everton had configured its operation to run without requiring validation, transfer, or explanation outside its own boundaries. Its documents closed themselves. Its last actions required no reply. By 2024, the former Everton site was once again reviewed during an ecological zoning update. Field inspectors, working under contract from a conservation survey team, recorded the area as forested with no visible foundations. Ground-penetrating imaging was not authorized for the zone, and the property retained its classification as closed industrial use with no heritage designation. The team submitted a routine log indicating no structures, no path markers, no remaining site identifiers. No additional inspection was scheduled. In early 2025, a joint archival initiative between 3 southern universities focused on categorizing 19th-century labor systems encountered Everton again. It was flagged during a routine pass through the Louisiana section of incomplete closures. Unlike entries marked by war disruption, natural loss, or succession ambiguity, Everton's pattern was internally symmetrical. Every document ended at or near the same year. All final entries appeared administratively closed, but without external trigger, citation, or response. A review committee within the initiative compiled a procedural timeline. Internal operations at Everton continued up to mid-1891. After that, references to activity ceased across multiple documentation channels, including tax registers, transportation manifests, and parish communications. No formal obstruction or suppression was identified. There was no statute at the time requiring disclosure of institutional withdrawal. What made Everton notable was not what it failed to do, but how completely its administrative systems converged towards silence. Throughout the cataloguing process, the committee found repeated use of a particular symbol in Everton's internal ledgers, a narrow triangle placed beside the final line of group entries. The mark was present in Registry C and appeared on over a dozen index cards preserved in unprocessed packets across 3 archival sites. The triangle did not correlate with known notary marks or regional clerical codes. When plotted chronologically, the symbol always appeared as the concluding annotation for groups labeled 4, 5, and 6. A semiotic analyst assigned to the project proposed that the triangle denoted terminal group status, marking completion of internal rotation cycles. Though speculative, the theory fit the observed structure of Everton's group phase annotations. No triangle appeared beside groups 1, 2, or 3 in earlier entries. The final triangle in the sequence corresponded to the last verified employment entry in 1891, aligning with the broader administrative silence that followed. This pattern was logged and submitted to the state's Historical Methods Division as part of the institutional closeout study. It was filed under the category Administrative Finalization Unaccompanied by Transition. The designation included Everton and 2 smaller facilities from other states, both of which had incomplete personnel resolution records, but no evidence of resistance, closure proceedings, or regional dispute. Later that same year, a researcher compiling digital pathway reconstructions of 19th-century industrial labor flows attempted to map Everton's outbound personnel based on surviving civil data. The program used probabilistic modeling to identify expected movement patterns following institutional closure. In Everton's case, the model returned no match points. Of the estimated 41 individuals last recorded at Everton, 0 were projected to appear in any subsequent civic or economic node across Louisiana or neighboring states. The program had a baseline variance of plus or minus 10%. For Everton, the deviation exceeded the model's failure threshold. The system flagged the entry as non-convergent. The researcher logged the result and added a note to the public database stating, "Workforce does not reappear in any modeled output. Movement pattern, voided. External transfer, unsupported." Following the entry's publication, inquiries from independent historical researchers resumed. Several requested clarification on whether Everton's internal documentation suggested intentional record separation. One analyst noted the language of the chapel rosters and administrative bulletins showed a shift in tone during the final years, adopting terms such as isolation period, external silence, and confirmation through totality. While speculative, the analysis proposed that Everton's operational design had moved toward a system in which the final configuration of labor no longer required interface with any external structure. In mid-2025, a routine metadata validation sweep at the State Digital Archive flagged Everton's remaining entries for uniformity correction. Staff noted that unlike other institutional profiles, Everton's logs included no scanned deeds, no closure forms, and no successor entity paperwork. Rather than deleting the entry or merging it with surrounding land tracts, the archive updated the Everton file to include a single placeholder document. The file listed a closed designation and stated, "Documentation concluded at source, closure presumed by absence." In that same month, a satellite-based terrain survey of northeastern Concordia Parish showed that the Everton tract had reforested fully. There were no visible lines of interruption, nor did any ground-level anomalies appear across the scan. Soil density remained consistent with long-term unmanaged growth. No markers, fences, or signs of excavation were detected. State environmental analysts labeled the area uninfluenced. No future use classification was applied. The site now appears on official maps as a nondescript green polygon with no annotation. It is referenced only by its parcel number and geographic coordinates. No narrative accompanies its listing. No access roads are maintained. Among archivists and historical systems researchers, Everton continues to be cited as a control case for unresolved institutional withdrawal. It is neither described as concealed nor contested. It is referenced only as a structure that ceased all public interface while maintaining internal administrative coherence through its final year. The term Everton model now appears in occasional academic presentations to denote systems that reach procedural completion without exit record or succession trace. No further rediscovery efforts are planned. The Everton documents remain sealed, scanned, and classified as non-expanding. Their vocabulary and indexing structures are preserved only for comparative study. Access to the original Registry C requires dual authorization and is limited to certified institutional analysts. The site itself remains unmarked. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.